Good evening, my friends. Now, on Tuesday of this week, I've been asked to give a bit of a lecture on the topic of something we're often thinking about here, the resurrection of Indo-European religion, particularly in the West, that is to say, Europe and America, utilizing Hindu DNA in terms of the rituals and other associated considerations to make it viable, authentic, and spiritually sound. Now, I was sitting down to draft some research notes for this lecture, and it occurred to me that I often do some of my best thinking out loud. So with that in mind, and by way of a bit of a curtain raiser or preview, I thought I would instead freestyle a first draft, so to speak, and present it on this page for your edification and enlightenment. So, with that in mind, a brief thesis on the resurrection of Indo-European religion, on the European side, from the Indo. Now, the first consideration which we need to address, I suppose, is the start of things, the foundation. It's a very good place to start. Namely, the Proto-Indo-European Urhimat. Now, we're not going to get into where this was, or how we can tell where it was. We're simply here to state the essential religious truth. The gods of the Proto-Indo-Europeans upon the Urhimat are the gods of the Indo-Europeans today. There was no ship of Theseus-style situation, whereby at some point on the treks to the west or to the east or to the north or to the south, these gods wound up bit by bit being replaced by foreign entities. This did not happen. Whether you are speaking about the Indo-European gods that were carried by their bearers, Parata in a certain sense, to Iceland, or whether you are speaking about the Indo-European gods that were carried to India, they are the same Indo-European gods. We can tell this partially by the sheer striking degree of resemblance between them if you know how to look, but also that simple logic I have aforementioned. Now, the reason why this is a vitally important understanding for us to have is because it indicates to us that what is theologically viable in terms of the worship in one sphere can therefore help to inform what should be theologically viable in another sphere, even on the other side of the world. That's the essential theme of tonight's talk, and of course that rather more in-depth presentation on Tuesday. How we do it, and of course alongside that, how we probably shouldn't do it. Now, in terms of why this is necessary, something which people often don't realize is just how little we actually have of the I suppose you might say the higher religion or the deep religion of the European side of things. We've been fantastically blessed to have great Greek epic poetry and plays and compilations of myths, but the extent to which the actual rituals and rites are directly attested is much more limited than that. And often what we find, even in the mythological corpus, is that various elements have been misunderstood, or if you might say myth-understood, by the people who were writing them down, who basically went around collecting tales from people, and then wound up often putting their own spin on things to make them sound a bit more epic, or to suit their own particular proclivities, in ways that could lead to essential meaning being obscurated, or even outright lost. It's great that we have those particular Greek tragedians like Euripides and Aeschylus and figures of that ilk, who are able to produce such incredibly stirring verses that they've managed to last 2,500 years to come down to us today. But where they may so happen to have bent things to render them more epic in the telling, well, this presents a bit of a problem to us when we're engaged in ritual reconstruction. It also is the case that, of course, religion, as with anything which is in human hands, even if it's permanent and eternal in its ultimate impetus, winds up changing and degrading with time. Or occasionally some changes, we may say, are divinely supported and mandated, but that's another matter for another time. And this can lead to further confusions. Now, a grand example of this, which I've talked a bit about in other videos, is the situation of Dionysus. Dionysus, as anybody can plainly see via a simple consultation of the comparative mythology, never mind the deep theology, is quite clearly the same deific as Lord Shiva. in the Hindu sphere. Lord Shiva, Rudra, as he is well known in the Vedic texts, is directly stated to be Dios Pitar in the Rig Veda. It's right there, it's uncontroversial. I've written about this at quite some length because people often seem to have this very peculiar perception that Dios Pitar is no longer worshipped. This is absolutely false. One of the most popular and prominent gods of the Hindu sphere today is in fact Dios Pitar, or as we would say in ancient Greek or Latin, Zeus Pater, I should possibly say, Jupiter. Now, this introduces a bit of a problem because, of course, if we then sort of go back into the Greek sphere, what we wind up with is the obvious question of how exactly is it that Dionysus can be Shiva if Shiva is also Zeus? Now, as it happens, there's some rather more esoteric conceptry which turns up in various sorts of ancient Greek theology and mythology, which appears to suggest that this isn't, well, it's a paradox, and as one of my English masters at high school used to say, a paradox is a seeming contradiction, which upon closer inspection is revealed to not be so. So, of course, Zeus being the father of Dionysus, and yet also Dionysus, being Zeus, is something which we seem to sort of find suggests in the sort of the Orphic mystery sort of side of things. We also wind up with these ancient attestations amongst the higher classical age for Dionysus being regarded as coterminous with Hades. Hades, of course, as we know, via the Zeus triophthalmos conceptry, Zeus the Three-eyed. Very appropriate for Rudra, you'd have to say. Hades being the same figure as Zeus also makes sense, which logically fits together when we consider one of the parentages of Dionysus featuring Persephone, who of course is more usually the wife of Hades, and you can see how it also adds another layer of confusion it might sort of suggest. Anyway, to cut a long story short, because there's not supposed to be another talk about Dionysus, the point is, by the sort of the Roman period, you wind up with Roman chroniclers almost tearing their hair out and reaching an eventual compromise of, okay, so in the empire we acknowledge 4 different Dionysuses. They're probably basically the same sort of deity, effectively, but there's 4 different ones of them in different areas, and we're going to acknowledge at the same time there's a sort of unity and differentiation, if you will, sort of to keep everybody happy. Even though some of these obviously correlate with sort of Hades, others are correlate with sort of Zeus, and others introduce other elements entirely, which sort of are there from that sort of that archaic Indo-European substrate, if you will. Anyway, so where I'm going with this is that level of confusion exists in the best attested non-Hindu sphere that we have available to us. As soon as you start talking about less attested spheres, where we don't have primary source materials or secondary source materials drawn from when the religion was still living, the problem exacerbates massively. So the grand example for this is the Nordic sphere, of course, whereby we have some very beautiful poetry which has come down to us via the hands of Snorri Sturluson and other people of that particular ilk. And of course the continental Germanic tradition has its own sort of vectors of preservation here and there. But it was written down, for the most part, decades after Christianization had meant that this was no longer a living religion. Some stuff couldn't be talked about, we believe. Other stuff, it just wasn't remembered to be talked about, except via the vague forms of myth and illusion that was, as I say, sort of vaguely half remembered. Now, the example which we use to illustrate this is, in fact, a ritual understanding, that of the mead of poetry. Now, a basic outline of this particular myth is that the mead of poetry is to be found harbored in a particular location under the sort of the custodianship of a woman, a divine woman called Gunlod. I'm mispronouncing that. My Old Norse is worse than my ecclesiastical Sanskrit. Gun effectively means battle or combat, and Lod is sort of an invitation to. Now, what happens is Odin must venture into somewhere called the Hnitbjorg, which effectively means the clashing rocks, in order to find this harboring for 3 days and 3 nights with this particular female figure. Some, we won't say romantic because somebody's heart gets unfortunately broken, but some sexual sort of exploits then ensue. Following which, Odin is able to obtain the mead of poetry and fly back to distribute it in the form of a raptor, that is to say, an eagle. A prominent creature for the Sky Father for iconographic reasons, as you can imagine, the king of the skies. Now, in terms of the mythic understanding, that's basically it. It's a mythic occurrence. It happens somewhere in mythic time, and then, of course, you can argue that various ritual actions resonate with it and draw from it. Mircea Eliade, the famed Romanian mythologist, a man who was, interestingly enough, he wasn't properly speaking religious. He never actually had, I don't believe, a proper religious experience, but he was so longing to have one that he constructed all these immense and wonderfully useful typologies of analysis to sort of artificially construct the sort of the parameters by which he might engage with one if one should happen to come around. It's quite a fascinating sort of thing and very useful for us. It's a sort of a cargo cultism that actually delivers the goods in a different pair of hands. But that is another matter. Anyway, in terms of this mythic typology for the meat of poetry, as soon as I read about this, I instantly connected it to something which we're very familiar with in the Hindu sphere, whereby we have a myth, several myths in fact, whereby Agni, who of course is also in this particular context Shiva, Rudra, same figure, and of course as we all know, Rudra is most definitely Odin. Agni carries in the form of Shaina, which is a sort of a falcon, that raptor bird form, the soma, the empowering elixir, to be distributed. There's a number of other sort of correlations in terms of 3 vessels or 3 offerings, and one bit gets dropped and so on and so forth, which unify the 2 myths between the sort of the Vedic and the Vedic spheres, which we won't go into for this particular juncture. You might be asking, so there's this vague commonality of 2 deities you can sort of co-identify, and there's also this vague commonality of an empowering elixir. Kvasir in the Old Norse, which means that which is pressed, and Soma in the Vedic Sanskrit, which means that which is pressed. Funny that. But whereas the Hnitbjörg, which is often thought of in these mythological terms as being, the clashing stones, a mountain fortress, which must open and shut to allow an entry. Well, in the Vedic end of things, we have the press stones, which of course you press that which is pressed in order to get the liquid out. It's just that while these are addressed in Vedic hymnals as being, sort of these, almost a location, like you actually wind up with it being addressed directly as it's sort of the Parvat, which means mountain, in at least one hymn that I can think of. It's also understood directly as ritual implements. In terms of the goddess that winds up being engaged with this process, Vastarasvati, the goddess of speech herself, is vitally necessary for this. And you find, for instance, the engagement of the Upasads, right? So Upasads meaning sort of invitation to attack, a siege, if you will. Well, that's what Gunlund means. Yes, of course. You see how it also connects together. But see, the thing is, we have the mythological presentation and preservation in the Vedic sphere. It's wonderful, these myths, for preserving things, but people forget they're not just the myths, they're also there for ritual preservation. But we also have the ritual manuals, the Brahmana commentaries, for example, which tell us how to turn these myths into actual ritual deeds that make sense, that resonate, and ensure that the offerings which we're preparing make their way upwards to the gods who are there to propitiate. That's what's missing with a lot of these Germanic sphere elements. We've got the mythic stuff. Now we need the bones, if you like, to actually sort of flesh out what's going on behind this and to guide it so that we can actually go, this is now going to be fit for purpose. Now, another dimension which we must pick up on with regard to this, and I will go back to the ritual side, I just forgot to mention it when it came to the Greek side of things, is that when we're talking about that situation of, how would you say, well, Zeus Triophthalmos, Zeus the Threeeyed One. Now, this crops up in Pausanias as a, it's not a throwaway line. It's something he finds rather remarkable because he goes to the citadel of Argos and he's sort of talking about these various, temples and shrines he encounters along the way. And one of them is, of course, this shrine of Zeus Triophthalmos, which is wooden, which is kind of expected. The murti, we would say, the idol. I don't like using that term idol because, of course, A, it's the Abrahamic thing for something which is a false idol, and B, in terms of the Indo-European understanding, it's not an idol that we worship. People often mistake this. It's like saluting the flag. You're not saluting some bit of cloth. You're saluting the country which it represents. In the same manner, the murti is alive. We invest them with life, the spark of divinity. There's particular rituals for it. Even our home ones are alive when we sort of carry out the relevant ritual section for it. But in terms of this murti of Zeus Triophthalmos, it's said to have come from Troy. I'm not quite sure how quite so plausible that is, but that's another matter. But Troy, as of course we know, was Western Anatolian, Luwian, Lycian, one of the two, sort of Indo-European sort of area. So whether it's the ancestral deity of Troy or whether it's simply a Greek deity, it's Indo-European all the way down. Anyway, the point is, it is understood not simply as three-eyed, but also as being both Zeus and Hades and Poseidon. It's all three deities in one. Hades, of course, being, as we know, dis pater, would be one of the Roman cognates, and you can see that cognate relationship with Deus pater, even though the dis bit ostensibly may be somewhat indirect in terms of meaning a wealthy father rather than necessarily the sky father directly. The wealth element also comes from divine. Anyway, I digress rather wildly. The point is, when we look at various Greek mythology, Roman mythology, we can have big arguments around, okay, so this deity over here has correlate elements, correlate ritual understandings, correlate mythology with this deity over here. An interesting example of this is Poseidon in this context of his equine fawn pursuit of Demeter, which of course correlates with, Demeter Erinyes is the relevant myth. And that links also via the some Vedic comparative modeling with the situation of Zeus in various animal form pursuing Nemesis, or pursuing sort of it's the situation that leads to Leda having the various pairs of twins that she does. I'll go into that some other time. The point is, while it requires an awful lot of sort of groundwork, spade work, and lining things up with our minds in the Greek sphere, because the documents, the interpretatio documents saying this is also this, don't tend to be quite so in evidence. Like we have some of those brief things, like the Greek figure who identifies a tradition in an area he was visiting about Hades and Dionysus being sort of co-identified. Most of the time, it's precisely that. It's those exercises in reconstruction. In the Vedic Hindu sphere, by contrast, we actually have the direct documents themselves which say, quite handily, yes, this deity is also this deity. A particular example is found in the Shatapatha Brahmana, which I'm often referencing for a number of reasons, where in Agnya Rudra, they go through 8 names and sort of forms and energies that he's associated with. So one of these is, of course, sort of Rudra, as mentioned. Another one of these is, of course, Vayu, the wind god, which so it matches up very well with the reconstructive typology. It's just that, of course, it's handy to have the direct thing. A third one is Parjanya. Now, I mention Parjanya because it annoys the hell out of me on a continual basis that some guy in the 1890s said, oh yes, of course, Parjanya, thunder, rainfall, obviously this is a form of Indra. And nobody bothered to check. Nobody bothered, because of course the Shatapatha Brahmana hadn't been translated at that stage, I suppose. If you knew how to look at the Rig Vedic text, you could see quite clearly that this was a sky father expression, but people, I suppose, as I said, they didn't bother. So it's become accepted orthodoxy all the way around the world, and especially on Wikipedia, that Parjanya is Indra. And so, of course, I find myself going, well, no. A, here's all of the stuff from the actual hymnals saying, sort of rather different things. And B, here's the direct equation from the Shatapatha Brahmana, which points out this is, in fact, the Sky Father once more. It all makes sense. But we don't have those things when it comes to these other more westerly Indo-European spheres, which means we have to rely upon all of these inferential elements. Now, as applies something like, say, Frigg and Freya, for example, to make it relevant to the Nordic sphere, there are endless online debates as to, and of course other debates offline, possibly carried out with axes, those fine Rudran theological arguments, as to whether Frigg and Freya are the same deity, are different aspects of the same deity, are different deities, or what. My personal position, which I can go into at some length some other time, is that yes, it is in fact the case that Frigg and Freya are strongly coterminous. There are a number of ways in which this may have come about, but despite the fact that people will often try and suggest that the elements from, sort of Sturluson's, it's the Heimskringla, but it's the Ynglinga saga, which talk about Freya in various sorts of regards. Oh, yes, this is Christian-era interpolation, or he's making up things, or whatever. No, they actually match up quite well with the Hindu sphere elements, which talk about the relevant wife of the Sky Father. That, of course, being Odin, that, of course, being Shiva, that, of course, being Zeus. We'll go into it some other time. But this is another area in which it's vitally important to have those Hindu elements to act as a sort of a check where we're unsure about stuff that's going on in the Germanic sphere or stuff that's going on in the Greek sphere, especially in the Germanic or Nordic sphere, because there's the risk that we're taking stuff that's either misunderstood or purposefully sort of shrouded in myth or echimerized, as of course the Ynglinga saga is, where they make, sort of Odin, this guy who comes from Troy, for example, in order to sort of see what's actually going on under it, if you will. Now, I said I would get back to the sort of the ritual side of things, and so I will. The reason why we're interested in the religious side of things, not just mythology, but the actual theology, there's a distinction which does need to be drawn here. Now, it's not because mythology means something is fake. That's not what it means at all. Eliade, once again, had a very sort of pithy phrasing of this, which I'm not going to be able to sort of reproduce precisely. But he pointed out that the meaning of mythology as something that's fake, a fake story, is itself a Christian a reworking of things. Talk about the beliefs of the guys over there, saying, they've got their pagan mythology, therefore it's fake. This wasn't what myth originally meant. Myth originally meant an explanatory story, something which told you something very important about the world you inhabited. And what could be more important than the gods and how we relate to them? In fact, Ernst Junger, the famed World War I war hero, who I'm often referencing in various capacities, pointed out that theology was therefore the queen of sciences. And it was partially because of the dethronement of this queen that the horrors of the 20th century, propelled by science, had in fact occurred. Therefore, were necessary to re-enthrone theology as her rightful position as the queen of the sciences. But I digress once again rather wildly at that. Mythology does not mean something that's fake. It's this explanatory story side of element. Theology, however, is it's actually sort of inquiring into these sorts of things, and it's not really that different from mythology. But in terms of the ritual side of things, it actually involves this much more involved discussion about how it is that we relate to the gods, our position in the world. Now, mythology is, of course, vital for this. It helps to ground this, to tell us a lot about this position, where we came from, how we relate to the gods, often in quite literal sense. I mean, there's Sky Father, of course, or Mother Goddess. Those terms are not there simply because they happen to fill a metrical spot in the meter. They're literally there because they're ancestors to us. This is something about being Indo-European, as it means you are a descendant, in some regards, from the gods, the sons of the sun, we often sort of say in my series upon the matter. What I'm sort of saying is, when we want to look behind some of the mythological bits and pieces where they talk about, okay, so and then the gods performed this rite, and see how it is we might perform these sorts of rites, or even go, there's this mythological action, how is it that we can actually carry out a ritual form of that as humans? That's where that theological understanding is vitally necessary. Now, one thing that's very common in the Hindu sphere is the worship of the god as guest. Now, there's a number of different ways you can do that. In our ritual guide series, which we're putting out at the moment, we've spent some time examining and unpacking and explaining the elements for what's known as a Pancha Upachara rite, which is, Pancha, 5, Pent, you can see the cognate there, PF sound shift, by the way, to get from Pent through to 5. Upachara is sort of a attendance upon, a sort of a service. So what you do in these rites is you invite the gods into your home. You give them an honor place to sit themselves down, and you carry out the festivities, if you will, the feasting, in their honor. So you offer them, as of course you'd expect, people who've sort of come a long way. You offer them some water to wash their hands and their faces in. In fact, you'll often be sort of bathing them yourself. You offer them some light refreshment before you get down to proceedings. You ask them how their journey was, the more sort of involved undertakings of this particular rite, which go beyond the 5 steps. It's a very intuitive and logical process. It's one of the things I love, is even though it might sound completely incomprehensible if you don't follow some of the sort of the Sanskrit involved, once you grasp what's actually going on, it's intuitive, it's logical, it makes sense. Anyway, I digress. The point is, all of these things which you do in this particular god as guest style of worship, you can kind of see quite a few of them cropping up in various other Indo-European understandings. Now, a good example of this is all of those mentions we find on sort of Nordic artifacts of particular nobility having played host to famous and great guests. Some of them may certainly be ordinary human chieftains who had invoked, sort of the right of hospitality. Sacred hospitality is quite bound up in this, as you might understand, because the sacred informs the template typology for not the mundane, but for the thing carried out by ordinary humans amongst each other. It's that mythic sort of recurrence, mythic resonance, eternal return. But in terms of some of these, I believe what actually happened is the gods were the guests that were being played host to. Those were the famous guests in question, and it makes logical sense. In terms of something like the Grimnismal, which is a great poem for a number of reasons, because what happens, for those of you unaware of it, is Odin has a bet with his wife. And this is something else which is pretty pervasive Indo-European theme, is the Skyfather has contests or occasionally outright arguments with his wife. In the Hindu sphere, they literally play dice with the universe. So take that, Einstein. But in terms of the, let's play a number of other games, including, war games, in fact, is one translation. So there's this beautiful image of Shiva and Parvati moving around. I suppose you might almost suggest beautifully painted figurines to play these war games, but that's another matter for another time. In terms, it also turns up in the Nordic corpus, kind of, but that's, again, I digress. In terms of these contests, in this particular case, there's a bet between Odin and his wife about the extent to which Geroth, the sort of a lord who Odin has taken under his wing and taught personally, is going to be able to abide by the sacred hospitality custom. Now, as is often the case with omnipotent and omniscient beings, the contest is less about what actually happens and more about how each side can flagrantly cheat wildly. Although cheat is a sort of not quite the right term here. It's not necessarily against the rules in this particular regard for Odin's wife to send an emissary to Geroth's court and say, okay, so a blue-robed figure is going to turn up amongst you. The gods aren't going sort of the dogs, I should say. We only are allowed to confuse gods and dogs. We're talking about some very specific stuff with regard to Tharva and Bava in the Shaivite corpus, that being two wolves of the Skyfather. But I digress. The dogs of Geroth's court aren't going to bark at this particular figure, and that's partially because this blue-mantled sort of figure is in disguise. He's actually a very powerful sorcerer who's going to kill you. Now, spoiler alert, that's exactly what happens. So it's not really cheating or lying, because of course it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because Geroth receives this blue-mantled stranger at his court, and immediately goes, well, the dogs didn't bark, this is a sorcerer here to kill me. We shall clap him in irons and place him between the fires of the court until he talks. And of course he does talk, but only to young Agnar, the son of Geroth, who actually sort of takes pity upon the stranger after hours and provides him with a single flagon of mead, in which exchange for Odin says that he'll be granted a boon like none other, right? A boon which the greatest possible return one could have for an ordinary flagon of mead, which is personal tutelage from Odin in the nature of everything and kingship of the race in question after Geroth dies, which is of course exactly what happens. Now, the interesting thing about this is that we have the god in question turning up in disguise, admittedly, and being found between two fires, where he is offered a particular style of offering, that being mead, in exchange for a boon, in this particular case, enlightenment. Now, this is not at all foreign to the Hindu sphere. We literally do this all the time. We invoke the gods out of the fire. Agni is what we put the offerings into. Agni, of course, as we've previously mentioned, being Shiva, Agni, of course, being Odin. And there's a suite of Agni as Odin conceptry that I've written upon quite extensively elsewhere. This gets quite controversial in some circles. It shouldn't, but it does for a number of reasons. Anyway, the point is, this notion of Odin being sort of found between the fires and being given an offering and then giving a boon, exactly what we should expect. So, I believe, on probative evidence value, that part of what's being encoded in the Grimnismal is basically a pretty standard Indo-European rite. There's some other sort of occurrences of this when it comes to both Germanic and also Greek or Roman. Again, mythologies, yes, I suppose it's the right word, mythology, whereby effectively a god sort of turns up and an offering is sort of made over the fire, through the fire, into the fire, etc., in this guest context, and the people who make the offering are blessed as a result. It sets up the gifting cycle, what's known as do ut des in Latin, and there's a directly cognate Sanskrit understanding, which sounds very similar, which I won't go off and break my flow by looking up at this particular juncture. We'll try and cover that properly in the actual thing on Tuesday. But you see, that's the thing. We have these elements which loosely sort of seem to align between that mythology and our both mythology and ritual over here. We have elements which bring things closer together. When we consider, for example, Lord Shiva as Adivracha, Vracha, you can translate it a few ways. Outlaw is probably one good translation. Going as, or vagrant, I think might actually be somewhat cognate, but going as sort of a rough, unkempt, barbaric-looking figure. And in the Atharva Veda, which has a quite a long series of hymnals in one chapter, the 15th, if I remember correctly, talking about this Vracha figure, there is a stern enjoyment, even to a great king, that when the Vracha turns up at your gate, you offer him the hospitality. You ensure that he drinks before you do. You treat him as the honored guest, because of his appearance, because otherwise, very bad things may happen indeed. Now, if we consider the situation of the Luckless King Geroth in the context of the Grimnismal, we can see the countervailing view, the argument in alternative, whereby somebody didn't treat the guest, that is the same god, Shiva, Odin, in the proper manner. And some very dire things ensued indeed. Of course, it happened. Geroth eventually realizes towards the end of the 9 nights that Odin has been there, Grimnir, of course, being the masked one, the one in disguise. He realizes it's his patron that has been there the whole time, and he gets up to sort of frantically to release him from the shackles. And in a state of sort of drunken stupor, or possibly because, coincidences happen around a certain god. That's actually how a lot of divine things happen. It looks like coincidence, but it's coincidence, if you will. Geroth trips over, coming down from his throne, and his sword slips out of its scabbard, and he manages to impale himself on his own sword and dies. Anyway, so you can see both sides of that. In the Vedic end of things, to do things properly, they they treat the god as guest in this manner because they know something bad will happen. Geroth, by contrast, is the cautionary tale whereby he didn't, and so therefore, things happen. In the Greek sphere, there are numerous tales whereby 3 gods are charged with upholding the sacred hospitality, but testing people's adherence to it. They being Zeus, Hermes, and Athena. Interesting point, that particular third one. Not necessarily who you just expect unless you sort of run the comparative mythology. And you wind up with all these tales of them going in disguise and doing exactly this. And in some cases, it works out very well for the people who treat them properly. And in other cases, it absolutely doesn't. But of course, in the Hindu sphere, when we're carrying out these god as guest rites, we know that the gods in question are the gods. We are deliberately invoking the gods as guests to come amongst us, because of course they're guests. How else are they going to get from wherever it is they are to wherever it is we are when we're carrying out the rite? It makes logical sense. These god as guests in disguise things are partially there to reinforce it, because it shows what happens if we, if we behave inappropriately with the gods as guests, because nobody would intend, or few people would intend, we should say, to deliberately go out and offend a god by behaving inappropriately in such a manner. In the Greek mythology, there actually are some people who deliberately intend to do such things. They come to rather sticky ends in Tartarus, as you could probably imagine. But those god as guests in disguise, myths, not metaphors, myths are there partially for that reason, to show what can happen if you don't do things properly, but also to sort of bridge the gap with the immanentization when it comes to sacred hospitality for ordinary people who are also acting in this particular role. One of the things we often overlook is that in the ritual space, in the mythological space, we step into these roles. We carry out roles that have been sort of worn before us, both worn in the sense of adorning like a mask, as Grimnir again, but also worn in the sense of like a a wagon rut, so to speak, a trail that we can follow down, which makes things a lot easier. We're colouring inside the lines with these, which reduces the risks to us quite significantly, as you might imagine, because if you start going outside the lines, strange things can happen. Now, that's actually a nice segue into the next thing which we do have to talk about, because we have been talking about 33 minutes here, which I'm surprised how far we've got. I shouldn't be. I could go on for hours about the subject. This other matter is precisely that notion of colouring inside the lines, because the difficulty that we have is, even though the broad overarching structure, if you will, of various of these rites, and of course the gods themselves, does basically align, there are particular things whereby we have to be quite careful. because they don't quite align in expression, if not necessarily in essence. Often the essence is fundamentally the same. It's the expression that's wound up differing, and that's where people get tangled up. Now, a good example of this is ritual offerings and ritual substitution, which goes alongside that. For example, if you were to go to a Hindu temple and try to offer a cow, like, you're going to kill the cow and you're going to sort of offer pieces of cow and so on and so forth, they'd probably wind up killing, well, in some parts, they would literally wind up killing you instead. In other parts, well, they might explain first why you're not going to do that, but and in other parts, there is still Pashu Bali, which means animal sacrifice is still carried out, although not of cows for a number of reasons. You might just consider, therefore, that because offering cattle and sacrifice is pretty important when it comes to sort of the Greek sphere or the sort of various other spheres, that there's some incongruity here. That there's some huge problem in terms of reconciling things. There isn't. The dominant principle we always have to have when we're going into somebody else's sphere, even though it's part of the general Indo-European sphere, is we must always do things that are A, right for the sphere that we're going into. We're the guest, and while we may be honoured as the guest, we must also not mess up the place we're walking into, point number one. So we play by their rules. The point number two is we always must make sure the essence of what we're doing, we understand it and why we're doing it, so that we may do it properly in a manner that it also comports with what we understand is necessary for us in our practice. So, in terms of those blood-spattered offerings of cattle, there's a particular bit in the Shatapatha Brahmana whereby they talk about exactly this, why it is that you're not supposed to be offering cows as sacrifice, generally speaking. Now, we won't quote the whole thing. We'll have to sort of save that, I suppose, for an upcoming thing, possibly this lecture I'll be giving. But suffice to say, there are good metaphysical reasons given for why we don't do that, and why, in fact, it's literally a demonic thing to do. Those metaphysical reasons actually do find co-expression to a certain point with what we find in the Greek corpus, with what we find in the Nordic corpus, when we consider, say, Amalthea and, of course, Orambula, the original cosmic cow. They match up quite well, so we can tell there's some archaic co-eternity going on here. Interestingly, that Shatapatha Brahmana verse actually does talk about specific sections whereby it is kind of semi-okay to actually be consuming some flesh of offered cow if you're of this particular tradition. But that's a minority tradition, and it's only after it's been offered in a very particular manner, which renders it, almost irresponsible not to be partaking of it. And those particular rites which enable that to be done have largely died out. They're not really a thing today. So it's not a get out of custom free card for people in the in America or Europe who really like their hamburgers. I know it's a bit of a meme, but some people really do. It's a thing. But who really like their consuming beef or steak or whatever to go, well, here's this 3,500-year-old precedent, therefore I'm going to do that. Unless you are actually of that particular layer and style of initiation and have just, the rites in question have been undertaken, no, you don't get to do that. I digress. What I'm saying is, in the Shatapatha Brahmana, there's also this ritual substitution framework, we might say, whereby it's considered almost a ladder or a totem pole of different offerings which you might offer, starting out with human sacrifice. Makes logical sense. I mean, it's both us and it's also resonant with the universe itself when we consider the circumstance of Purusha, the cosmic man, as being what we're trying to resonate with. Purusha is not really correlate with Ymir, but that's a whole separate discussion for a whole other time. It starts out with human sacrifice, and then it works its way up through various sorts of animals that you could sacrifice instead, which might actually be more preferable, more ritually clean in some regards. And then it goes from those animal sacrifices into other forms of offering, including effectively vegetable matter and baked desserts, which is interesting. It turns out the gods have a sweet tooth. In fact, having spent an appreciable portion of the last 2 months cooking and preparing various things at home, including panchamrit, which involves a large amount of sugarcane, or these Indian sweets I happened to buy last week out on some errands. The gods do not have diabetes because, of course, they're gods. Ordinary people subsisting on such a diet would have to have quite the active lifestyle indeed. I'll put it that way. Anyway, Substitution. The point is, these ritual substitution formulas go from one end of the spectrum to the other. and they set out how the essential essence of sacrifice can be done in a way that actually is more pure, in fact, down that other end of the spectrum. So you don't get a whole bunch of the impurities which would accrue to you, the sin which would accrue to you of or tamasic energy is not really sin, but so that sort of dark lower energy, we might sort of say, in carrying out these other and lower forms of sacrifice. So it's a higher form of sacrifice that you're being enjoined to engage with. And it still has a lot of the symbolically resonant things. So, for example, the tilaka, which gets applied to our forehead. If you've seen, not the woman with the sort of that style of sort of bindi, etc., but tilaka is after you've carried out a Hindu rite, a pandit may apply a red smear of vermilion to your forehead. This is a symbolic resonancy for the blood of the sacrificial victim. Of course, it's not actually blood because it's sort of sorry, momentarily sort of lapse of consciousness there. Not cinnabar, that's the old alchemical name for it. It's vermilion, that's what I was thinking of. It's a resonancy which has the symbolic effect of saying, yep, I've carried out this rite, I have the blessing, it is over my sort of my brow towards the sort of the third eye, all good, excellent. But in terms of how this works with sort of say the reconstructive typology, we know how these things work in the Hindu sphere, and we know why we do and don't do things. The extent to which we have the high theology, you might sort of say, to know why it is that we don't or do things in the Greek sphere or in the Nordic sphere is a lot more limited. We have various verses from the Havamal well, Hesiod's Works and Days is a good example as well, and of course the Iliad has some stuff as well, whereby there's these offhanded comments about how you perform particular things, like in Hesiod, not performing rites before you've washed your hands, otherwise, bad things happen basically. But in terms of how and why we do a lot of these ritual acts, we don't have those detailed commentaries. The question for us, in terms of the reconstruction, when we're grafting, if you will, the Vedic sphere elements, Hindu sphere elements, onto the Edic sphere or the Hellenic sphere, is what is appropriate to just directly sort of port over, and what requires consideration for these different metaphysical elements, especially if we're taking the approach that effectively tries to find already resonant expressions over here in these Western spheres, and go, okay, we'll just run it on the implicit logic as the engine of this Hindu sphere rite. Like, you're not going to be able to do that, for example, with cattle offering. It just, if you were some high-level Vedic Acharya, you might be able to guide such a thing so it would work and not wind up offending the hell out of certain gods. We don't really have many of those engaged in Indo-European reconstructive work, so I wouldn't advise doing it. We always must play it safe, because the last thing you want to do in trying to please the gods is wind up screwing up and winding up offending them as a result. There's literal stages in Hindu ritual in which we ask their forbearance to basically sort of ask their forbearance and their forgiveness if we have inadvertently wound up offending them. The other element to be considered, just while I'm talking about that, is that usually refers to the invocations. Now, this presents an entire dimension of difficulty for us because Sanskrit is the language of the universe. Speaking in Sanskrit, especially with the appropriate understanding of what you're doing, it is literally, and I mean literally, to engage with something that's quite foundational to everything around us. It causes effects simply by speaking it. It then potentiates the effects by knowing how to speak it and the appropriate, your intent with it, and the appropriate stuff you're trying to do alongside with it, the ritual gestures, etc. To give an indication of why this can be quite fraught, in the process sphere which Vritra, the demon dragon, was being sort of congealed, which of course involves Sanskrit liturgy, a single syllable was mispronounced. The invocation in question should have granted Vritra immortality, invulnerability. Instead, that single syllable being mispronounced fated him to be killed by Indra, which of course eventually happened. So as you can see, it's a very risky thing to do if you don't know what you're doing. Because imagine if that was you. You sort of casually wind up fating yourself to be killed or something. Anyway, I digress. We have a bit of an issue here because, of course, everybody wants, quite understandably, their own ancestral tongue to be a liturgical language of power. And I think there's some validity to that. I think that in ancient Greek, they carried out rites in ancient Greek, often quite archaic ancient Greek. Homeric Greek, as people have often pointed out, is well, both A, archaic, and in terms of some of the bits that are sort of missing when you actually sort of recite it, slight half syllable here and there, it points that it was even more archaic initially in its actual composition. I digress. The point is, ancient Greek writes, yeah, sure. I would thoroughly endorse if you're invoking ancient Greek forms of these Indo-European deities using ancient Greek with the appropriate liturgical formulas and phrasings if we have them. And in ancient Greek, often we can cobble them together, especially because there are actually some guys out there who do a pretty good job of putting together sentences in ancient Greek for exactly this sort of purpose. It's wonderful. When it comes to Old Norse, we're in a bit more of a sticky situation because we're working with a less understood language when it comes to stuff that we do have. Like we have various kennings and theonyms and bits that look like they probably are ritual invocations. But in some cases, we're genuinely unsure if that's actually what they are, or if that's actually what they're supposed to be understood as. Now, a grand example of this is, I'm going to mispronounce this again. Earlier this week, there was a bit of a debate that was going on about whether the moon is sort of male or female, and of course, whether the moon's female because it sort of receives sunlight or something. And I was pointing out this is a modern understanding, but both of them, leaving aside the Greeks understand the moon to primarily be female. I was pointing out the notion of the moon receiving sunlight is quite a modern sort of thing, and it probably isn't really the case that the Old Norse viewed the moon that way. By pointing to a particular term utilized to refer to the moon, Mylin, I think was the term in question, which means flaming, sort of on fire, basically. Self-luminous, we might sort of surmise, is the key point of that. Now, I went off to sort of dig up the actual etymology of this to make sure the translation was correct, and we wound up with, quite handily, it also occurring in, potentially, lists of kennings for, well, not kennings, heti, I should say, heti, for, for the sun and, of course, for fire. So you might assume that's case closed. That makes logical sense. Except, A, we don't quite know what it means because we haven't actually unpacked the etymology for it, and I don't think we possibly really sort of can. It's all sort of theoretical. And B, various of those attestations for it being Mylin rather than a different word which has a U in it, basically because of various versions of the text that has come down to us being written in that way, whereas various other versions of the text have it written in a different way. So we kind of are having to sort of wing it there in terms of whether this word actually is the right word, whether it's sort of understood in this particular way, or whether it's something else entirely. You can see how this gets quite difficult quite fast. So, in those circumstances, it's certainly possible that we can sort of attempt to reconstruct basic liturgy when it comes to Old Norse. In fact, it'd be almost sort of a waste of expertise out there somewhere in the world if we didn't try and do that. And it's definitely the case that Old Norse and Proto-Germanic are powerful languages. I mean, even leaving aside the intent issue, the reason why we have Galdara and stuff like that is because you can do stuff like what we do with the sort of the Sanskrit verses and mantras and stotrams and things with this language. Runes exist to give it physical form, patterns in reality in a different sort of sense. That's what these ecclesiastical languages are. Patterns in reality and ways of giving them shape. That's why they resonate with reality. But I must say, Vedic Sanskrit is incredibly complex. That ought to go almost without saying. Like, the same word can have multiple layers of meaning. The same verse can have multiple layers of meaning. It's all deliberately in there. The answer when you present it with two different translations, provided they're good translations, which may differ in this regard, is, well, yes, they're both correct. The trouble with this is if you're trying to construct things in such a manner, it requires, well, divine inspiration is basically the only way you can actually really sort of do it a lot of the time, especially because there might be multiple meanings or hidden traps in what you've constructed that you don't realize until somebody enunciates, and then all hell breaks loose, possibly metaphorically speaking, possibly rather more literally. But in terms of, sort of the Old Norse sort of side of things, that's the other thing. Like, we have significant difficulty with unpicking what exactly some verses actually sort of mean. There's a particular example from that, I can't remember the name of the poem, but I posted about it about a week or two ago. By most translations have the relevant verse which of something for Odin bestowing as referring to to vigor, to the quality of manliness, to courage, to heart. A modern translation, which actually does seem to make a semblance of sense, has it as bestowing the quality of love, which you can see how, sort of quality of heart and quality of love, well, you can see how those are quite different. One of those involves running at somebody wielding a sword. The other one of which, with deference to certain circumstances that may be embroiled in, involves running at somebody with a sword because you're trying to sort of get to and rescue sort of the princess on the other side. So somewhat coterminous, but also somewhat risky to potentially invoke if you don't know quite what you're doing. I digress. It becomes an issue when people try and mix these two things together. So, for example, some guy who's notionally a Vaishnava Acharya or something, I don't mean to dispute the man's credentials. I don't have the ability to speak about his credentials. I haven't looked into them in any seriousness. But he put out these things called Thor mantras. And it's great that this particular white American, I think, this particular American sort of Vaishnava has gone, yes, let's get into the Indo-European side of things, because often in the Hindu sphere, people react rather negatively to this, sort of this commingling of peoples and the recognition of the shared heritage. So I can understand his enthusiasm and think that's great. I mean, more power to him in that regard. But what he did was he took some Gayatri mantra formulations and he swapped out particular words and swapped in their place a word of Old Norse here, sort of some continental Germanic there, and it was basically Sanskrit with this sort of this hodgepodge of non-Sanskrit elements. And in places that were rather peculiar for the actual sort of internal functioning of the mantras in question, in my, well, I suppose somewhat expert opinion. But the point I'm making is, I would be very cautious about doing that for the simple reason that if you're not playing around, of course, if you're attempting to sort of recite or engage with these fundamental building blocks of reality, words versus stringing them together to create powerful metaphysical effect, one of the last things you probably want to do is commingle things so that you're crossing the streams, to reference Ghostbusters. Like, for example, well, actually, that's an interesting example. So, Kaal in Sanskrit, Kaal, I pronounce egregiously a lot of the time. It means a number of things: time, death, black, iron, and often all at once. So Oppenheimer, with his "I now have become death, the shatterer of worlds," the word he's translating as death is, of course, Kaal, and it actually, in terms of the original verse in the Bhagavad Gita, the time understanding makes a lot more sense because it's the inevitability of the guys who Arjuna is supposed to be going out and killing. The inevitability of them being killed anyway. That is partially why he's supposed to feel less guilty about going out and doing his duty. So time, but of course that doesn't really work with the an atomic bomb, does it? Anyway, side issue. The point is, it sounds kind of like C.A.R, which of course is Germanic for man. So if you're reciting something and you want to basically sort of say, talk about man or something, and instead of using Sanskrit, there's a bunch of terms for man which we could use, etc., would make logical sense. But instead of using those terms for man, you decide you're going to put in Carl, and it sounds like Carl. Well, the fact that man and death have just sort of possibly occurred in the same place may lead to some very worrisome things occurring indeed if you happen to be the man in question. So, so you can see why that's an area to be sort of quite careful with when it comes to the obvious thing people are often wanting to do, which is simply to commingle two things in together. Anyway, I got slightly sort of sidetracked on that. We should go back to sort of the ritual considerations element of it. What I actually meant to say with that was essence. Essence above all is the superior rubric. And making sure the expression of that essence can be done in a way that is commensurate, that honors what's supposed to be going on. Now, I'm biased by the facts. Great thing to be biased by. And of course, also personal experience. One of the things which, I speak of when it comes to these theological conversations is I'm not one for books. I'm not one for reading. I'm one for, for doing, for experiencing, for what I've seen with my own eyes, carried out with my own hands, had done for me by various priests of various temples and various learned associates who I owe great debts of gratitude and honor. And in that particular case, I can say with absolute certainty that Vedic rites, Hindu rites, they work, they resonate, in my case, they've delivered quite some miracles. And I've been asked to talk a bit about personal circumstances in this lecture on Tuesday, so we'll see how that goes. So I can say those work. And that means that because we know how they work, we know that they do work, and we have all the considerations around how to do them and how they should work, we generally wind up prioritizing the Hindu sphere elements over elements from these other more Westly spheres that we have less understanding of, simply because it's safe. It is recourse through to stuff that we know all of these things on, that we have control over. Well, that's not quite the right word. What is the right word? We have the ability to make work in the ways that it should work, rather than sort of hope and prayer, we might sort of say, reciting things and sort of hoping that we aren't missing a whole bunch of things that nobody wrote down because it was supposed to be secret, or because everybody knew to do them. Like, to use an example for that, the Roman recipe for concrete. Now, people for years upon years, decades, didn't know how the Romans made concrete. They had the recipe and they kept following it, and it kept not working and having the works underwater quality that it should have had. It later turned out that the recipe had been misunderstood because it had water. Now, the Romans just went, okay, well, obviously that's seawater with the salt in it. So they didn't bother saying, well, obviously that's seawater. They just went, it's water, we'll just do that. As long as the traditional understanding was sort of transmitted, it was fine, because you could keep using seawater and people keep doing it. But when the recipe is rediscovered centuries later, and we try doing things without the seawater and just with regular water, it doesn't work. And it's only when somebody goes, hold on a minute, maybe they meant seawater, that we actually sort of re-unlock the authentic understanding. The issue being that you can construct all sorts of buildings that may very badly sort of not live up to the engineering standards they're supposed to in that meantime, while you don't have that understanding, which in the context of carrying out rites and stuff could be very dire indeed. Hence why, as I say, in cases of doubt, we default to the Hindu understanding, because we have it, we know it, and we know that it works, and we know that it's pleasing to the gods in question. That is always the most important consideration. Now, in terms of that essence side of things, therefore, one interesting consideration is with these ritual substitution side of things, which we have attested around the place, it can make things that weren't quite so sort of either prominent or attested in the sort of the ancient texts more available to ordinary people, because back then having a priest or sort of a village holy man, a lot easier. For a lot of people outside the Hindu sphere, this isn't a thing. Like thing is a rather ironic choice of words, of course, the Germanic sphere. But in terms of finding, say, a temple to go to, or a holy man you trust, it can be quite an ordeal. I'm incredibly lucky, blessed. Shiva translates as auspiciousness, so lucky is one interesting way to render it. As a particular priest in my temple was often fond of rendering Om Namah Shivaya in an idiomatic form as good luck. He was not incorrect. But in terms of, I'm lucky to have 2 or 3 temples within even walking distance of where I am right now. I'm a regular at least one of them. Up until lockdowns happened, I was there literally twice a week or more every week for near 6 years or more. It's quite a span. But most people don't have that outside the Hindu sphere. Some people in big cities are lucky to have Hindu temples they could potentially go to, although, of course, there's a bit of a psychological barrier there for obvious reasons. It can be an interesting experience being the only non-Indian person in the building, especially when there are 300 plus people on, say, Mahashivratri, or even 1,000. But I digress. Household rites, stuff you can perform in your own home, those sort of lower level things are therefore quite essential. And because they're so sort of humdrum mundane, they don't often get written about as much in the sort of the archaic texts of the Western European sphere, because they're not that epic. They're not the sort of the stuff that royalty's paying you by the word to sort of to eulogize. So we don't have that much to go on, except of course via the Hindu sphere and these things that are resonancies for the bigger and more ornate rites, but that you can still carry out in your own home. In terms of particular offerings, I talked about the mead of poetry as being one particular thing that we have the mythology on, to sort of go, okay, well, there's quite logically a ritual understanding that's encoded within this. We just don't have the direct stuff to make it work directly. We can venture a reconstruction, but we're somewhat limited by the fact that we don't know what exactly the mead of poetry is. One approach to ritual substitution which people would probably engage in the Germanic sphere is they would probably go, okay, well, mead is mead. It's kind of understandable. I can see how that works, actually. That, in the Germanic sphere, yeah, sure, there's something quite logical to that. And if you are worshipping Germanic gods in a Germanic fashion, then yeah, sure, having a drink with one's gods is probably entirely appropriate. However, if you're starting to operate in the Hindu sphere, for example, offering alcohol to particular deities Well, that's no, that doesn't. Well, it does happen for particular deity forms and in particular contexts. Often these are rather wrathful deities, and often that means that somebody is going to encounter a very wrathful deity indeed. So you may not wish to do that unless you're very sure you want to be invoking a very wrathful deity, which is a risky thing to do. Invoking wrathful deities in your own home, well, not often something you should do unless you're very certain about it for a number of reasons. Anyway, side issue. So as you can see, sort of colouring outside the lines or sort of commingling things can cause interesting issues. The actual mythic meat of poetry, I would surmise, based around an array of comparative evidence, is likely some preparation that, well, in archaic ritual sense, would be a psilocybin mushroom preparation. There's various reasons for it. I won't go into them now because we're just about to hit an hour. We're at 59 minutes, 55 seconds. But in terms of simply going, okay, we can substitute with alcohol for this, that's, well, it's a bit of a thin substitute, which does not necessarily mean it's sort of inadmissible, just that it's A, thin, and B should be kept over there. I mean, I assume that wine and sort of the Greek end of things is a similar sort of thing, especially because there's some peculiar stuff around what appears to be wine may have displaced some of the other elements that were more archaically used, which I'll get into at some other time. In the Hindu sphere, if we're sort of carrying out these sorts of various sorts of offerings, one ritual substitution for the empowering elixir in question is panchamrit, which is a really simple to make thing at the lower end of things. You can't eat more than 8, featuring milk, ghee, which is clarified butter, jaggery, which is sugarcane in sort of crystallized sort of format. What's the other ingredients? Honey, so liquid honey, sort of really quite good for that. And okay, milk, ghee, honey, jaggery, and I'm missing that fifth particular sort of ingredient. What else do I put in it at that particular juncture? Well, this is horribly embarrassing. Sorry, it's been a very long day. I'm actually going to look this up. Sorry, it's a mental block which sort of occasion. Oh, that's right, curd. Okay, sorry. Okay, so curd, or as we would probably know it, unsweetened yogurt. That was very embarrassing. I do apologize. Anyway, so you got those 5 ingredients. Hence, pancha amrit, sort of the immortality amrit, sort of ambrosia's direct cognate. Nectar is sort of a figurative cognate because it leads you through death. Pancha, of course, being 5, so the 5 things coming together which produce that empowering elixir, sort of a resonancy thereof. It's not going to have quite the effect of the actual amrit or the actual Vedically prepared soma, but for ritual purposes in your own home, yep, sure, good, cool. And the gods find it, of course, rather pleasing. Now, that's a useful understanding to have because, of course, in terms of these, something which I can sort of offer in my home, I don't think that gods are going to find it sort of inappropriate wherever you are in the Indo-European sphere to have milk offered. In fact, we appear to have a pretty broad Indo-European thing of white liquid libations, especially upon a pillar of sorts, as an essential rite. Sweetened white milk in particular, often with some other stuff mixed in with it. I may look at that in more detail at some other time. As it applies the mythic sort of side of things, I believe that Yggdrasil itself is watered with a similar substance by the ash nymphs, as we've covered elsewhere. The Meliae in Greek understanding, of course, being both ash nymphs, honey nymphs, spear-wielding nymphs. You get the idea. The point is, what we see in the Hindu sphere isn't inappropriate in that context, I would surmise, to offer in other Indo-European spheres. We have the attestations for these dairy product offerings being useful and being received positively. The converse is not necessarily true around alcohol sort of offerings being warmly accepted in sort of particular Hindu sphere elements, even though they may be perfectly viable in those Greek or those Nordic elements. But that's because, as we've said, the alcohol is sort of tamasic in its particular nature. We're looking for something which is quite sort of sattvic, sort of holy, high holy, clear, truthful, difficult to translate in that particular regard, as I'm sure you understand. Anyway, I've been rambling now, and I'm sort of losing energy to actually sort of be focused. I'm not sure how many people are actually going to follow a 1 hour and 4 minute long sort of thing, so I should probably draw things to a close, especially because this was supposed to be a brief mental draft out loud of things, and a bit of a curtain raiser rather than doing everything substantive, which I'm going to be addressing on Tuesday. So we'll draw things to a close there. There'll be further substantive elements, considerations, and contradictions that must be sort of parsed, addressed when we come back on Tuesday. It's I think it's 7 or 8 o'clock. I'll check the time so we don't sort of lead people astray in this particular regard. It's what time are we doing things? Right. Okay. So British time, which because they're a British-based group, which we're sort of promulgating to, it's going to be at 7 p.m. on Tuesday, the 28th. New Zealand time, I think that's 8 a.m. or thereabouts my time, so we'll see how that plays out for me. I'm a nocturnal person by creature of habit, so I'm sure you can work out if you're in between New Zealand and Britain, whereabouts it is that you may happen to fit in order to be able to catch it. It'll be done via Zoom. We're also recording it. There'll be a sort of a YouTube link where you can sort of follow things, and well, for particular people who've hit me up about it, a Zoom link which they can sort of join it in order to be able to ask questions during the Q&A session after the hour that I'm supposed to be religiously keeping myself to, and I'm going to have great difficulty doing that therein. Anyway, thank you for listening if you've made it this far. I do apologize for several misunderstandings, mispronunciations, or my general accent, etc., such as it may be, and the fact that I spent about a minute forgetting the fifth ingredient into Panchamra because it's a rather warm summer's night, and my body and brain is designed for very more bracing Nordic climates rather than necessarily somewhere which is currently even as high as 21 degrees. As you can see, I'm sweating with the humidity, etc. One of the many reasons I haven't actually managed to make it all the way to India is precisely because I know it would just melt. Anyway, we're here to engage in that most holy of missions, Karinvanto Vishvamaryam. So, with that in mind, Jai Mata DJ, Jai Sri Rudra, hail to the gods. Namah Shivaya.